So let's go back to, I think, was your first book Never Eat Alone? Or is that...
Yeah. So basically that crazy career, right, which was very precocious, got the attention of Inc. magazine. And they, this young man named Tal Raz reached out to me and wanted to write an article about why people have disproportionate success over others. And I thought about it. And again, another great tip to your listeners, you know, somebody reached out to me and said, hey, I want to interview you. You could just do that and then pass on, right? But what I did is I said, you know, I'm going to take the time for this young man and I'm going to come up with the 10 tips that I think were instrumental to my success. And those 10 tips ended up being, instead of him interviewing me for an article, he ended up making the article about me. And it ended up being a massive feature piece. It was one of the most popular pieces and ultimately most viral pieces that they have ever had at Inc. magazine. And it was called 10 Tips of a Master Networker. And I had not called myself a networker. I actually wouldn't have used those words. I found that word repugnant. Back in those days, the word networking was a little dirty. It was usury. And I think one of the things that I've done in my life, in my career, is I've transformed that word a bit. Because my book, which I ultimately resisted the word networking, because what happened was when the article came out, I was like, oh, I hate this positioning. And my revenge was hiring the young man who wrote the article to help me write my book. And we wrote the book and it became a New York Times bestseller. And it was sort of no looking back from there. But what I learned, and the core of that, and the core of all my work today, is that to be successful in relationships, there are two fundamental attributes of all great relationships, whether they're business, whether they're personal, and that is real intimacy, real and to the point of vulnerability. I love Brene Brown's work. Never Eat Alone was proselytizing vulnerability long before that work was published. And again, not a competition, but it's just like I've always believed very strongly in the importance of vulnerability in relationships. The way I look at it is empathy is the bridge to a beautiful relationship, but the golden key is vulnerability to open empathy. And that opening of that gate to empathy is that vulnerable sharing. One of the reasons why, and it was wise on your part to start a dialogue with me on the personal side, right? Because it breeds for your audience a sense of empathy with the person sitting here. So ideas become more absorptive. People lean in, they open themselves. I call the word I created was not, I didn't create it, but it was there. It's called porosity. How do you open people to each other? And then the issue is that people are busy, and intimacy can seldom be gained if another person who's very busy doesn't see the value in the relationship. So really leading with generosity was the earmark of Never Eat Alone. How do you engineer a network with yourself leading with generosity to others? Now, it then follows on in my second book, Who's Got Your Back, to talk about how relationships become incredibly productive. And we recognize that the most productive relationships are relationships that have high degrees of candor, truth-telling that's difficult, right? Which most organizations do not have good transparency. They do not have good candor. Our work shows that on an average of 0 to 5, the average team is 2.4 in their ability to have candor with each other. It's pretty bad. But then in addition to candor, you need butt-kicking accountability. Again, our work on teams shifts accountability. There's an old mindset of accountability is I'm accountable to a number, I'm accountable to my boss. So you're accountable up. But we move that down and say we're accountable to each other. Massive shift. You can get a team crossing the finish line together, owning each other's success, responsible for each other's failure, game-changing. And that's what we coach to. And then that's what we wrote about in Leading Without Authority. How do you lead your peers? That was the intention of that book. How do you actually lead your peers when you're trying to get stuff done? Yeah. And then the last one,
Competing in the new world of work.
at the peak of the pandemic, I saw this as an inflection point. So I said to my research institute, I said, listen, I'm not traveling anymore. I'm sitting here, right here on my butt. How do we perform in a way that will really add to our research? And so we decided to do a research study, which ended up being 2,000 individuals, on how do we crawl out of the pandemic and not go back to work, but go forward to work. And the wisdom of those 2,000 individuals is in this book, Competing in the New World of Work. And it was Harvard's top pick coming out of the pandemic. So really proud of that.